Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Timothy Lee, and I'm a research analyst with Red Cloud Securities, and I'm delighted to host a Red Cloud webinar on nickel exploration today. We will hear from Ian Fraser, the CEO and VP Exploration, and Doug Porter, President and CFO of Fathom Nickel. During today's webinar, they will provide an overview and outlook. Then we will take questions. You can type your questions into the chat box at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. Before we kick things off, first we need to discuss some fine print. During this Fathom Nickel webinar, forward-looking statements may be made. I would direct listeners to the company's forward-looking statements disclosure outlined on page 2 of the corporate presentation, and that can be found on the company's website, fathomnickel.com. For Red Cloud Securities, Inc., I would highlight that this webinar is for information purposes only. It should not be considered a solicitation or a recommendation to buy or sell securities. We note that this call does not consider the particular situation or needs of individual investors. Participants should rely on their own investigation and seek their own professional advice before investing. Please see our most recent research located on the Red Cloud website for specific disclosures pertaining to Fathom Nickel. So we have Fathom Nickel presenting today. The company is exploring for nickel in Saskatchewan, a province that certainly has a rich history of mining and mineral exploration, but you might not have thought about for nickel exploration. With that, I now turn it over to Ian and Doug to update our audience on the company.
Great. Thanks, Timothy. Again, my name is Doug Porter. I'm the president and CFO of Fathom Nickel. I'm here with my colleague, Ian Fraser. For those of you who aren't familiar with Fathom, I'll just give a brief overview of the company, our two primary projects, our Ghost Sugar Lake project and our Albert Lake project, as Timothy mentioned, both in north central Saskatchewan. And then I'm going to hand it over to Ian. He can delve a little bit deeper into our recent exploration programs and some of our plans for our go-forward process. Timothy has already directed you to the notice to reader, which is up on our website. I would invite people to peruse that at their leisure. I know everybody says that, and it's not sure anybody ever actually does it, but please, when you have a chance, have a look at our forward-looking statements. So Fathom, our story is, based on our name, obviously nickel, but broader than that, we are looking for base metals in the energy transition business. So at our Albert Lake project, we have nickel, copper, and platinum group elements. At our Ghost Sugar Lake project, we're focused on nickel along with copper and cobalt. And I think it's important to also point out that while these are all in some form or another energy transition metals, first and foremost, they are base industrial metals. And the uses that historically that we've used those minerals for aren't going away. We're just adding a new element to that with the energy transition and the EV battery business. And so that is our focus here at Fathom. And right now, we've got two particularly projected or prospective projects that really have a nickel focus. So Saskatchewan, it really is a top-tier jurisdiction. It is featured as a top 5 worldwide location for exploration work by the Fraser Institute. I think this year it's number 3. And we can attest to that. I mean, it's a great jurisdiction from a geological perspective. It has been vastly overlooked for base metals. Other than uranium, and it is a very good place from a regulatory perspective. We've got a government who is supportive. They've just added additional tax incentives. They've added an additional incentive around exploration work. We've got a very, very good local community, our Indigenous partners have been fantastic to work with. And we really can't say enough about Saskatchewan. I mean, the extractive industries aren't getting any easier when it comes to ESG, but in comparison to many other places on this planet and within this country, we wouldn't hesitate to put Saskatchewan at or near the top of that list. So just quickly, we have been public for about 3 years. Fathom has existed going back to 2015. We had the opportunity to acquire the Albert Lake project. At the time, it was called Rottenstone in 2015. And that became the project within which we went public. Since going public, we've raised a total of $24 million. And we've done that, of course, in very, very difficult junior markets. And we think we've deployed that capital in a very efficient and effective manner. And we'll get into the details about how we've moved our Albert Lake project forward, and we've added a second project at the Gochagger Lake. So again, we've got a growing portfolio of projects. Right now, we're focused again in Saskatchewan, Albert Lake. We've now built Albert Lake up to over 90,000 hectares. When we first optioned into this project, it was less than 10,000. And based on what we were seeing, what we've accumulated in the roughly 26,000 meters of drilling that we've done, we've made the decision to expand that footprint. So we're now up over 90,000 hectares at Albert Lake. What attracted us to Albert Lake in the first place was the historic grade of the production that came out of this project in the late 1960s. The production grades returned nickel of 3.3%, copper of 1.8%, and platinum group elements of nearly 10 grams per ton. I mean, those are absolutely world-class grades on a standalone basis. But when you put them all together, I mean, this really is a world-class grade. The knock against the project is it was small. There was 26,000 tons mined out of an estimated 50 to 60,000 tons in that historic mining camp. But our theory was you cannot have that concentration of metal occurring in isolation. It has to really be part of a bigger system. And since going public, we've proven that with the discovery of the Bay Island Trend, which is a 300 plus meter mineralized corridor that's about 500 to 600 meters away from the historic Rottenstone mine. And now we're working on an area, the Tremblay-Olsen area, which is about 1.5 kilometers south of the historic Rottenstone mine, in an area where we've got coincident field geochemistry, geophysics, and geology all stacking up really, really nicely. Now, we just completed a drill program in February. We should have assay results out on the Albert Lake project later this week. And Ian will get into the details around that. But we've got some really, really exciting things developing at the Tremblay-Olsen area. In September of 2022, we went from a one project company to a two project company by adding Gochagger Lake. We optioned into Gochagger, which at the time was about 4,800 hectares. And we had the opportunity to acquire 100% ownership of Gochagger by investing $2 million in exploration work over a 4-year period. We've now completed that exploration spend, and we just have a small payment due to the vendor and the issuance of about 600,000 Fathom shares to complete, and we will own 100% of Gochagger. With our very first hole at Gochagger, which was drilled in February of last year, we intercepted 58 meters of 1.5% nickel, which, as it turns out, was a top 10 nickel hole as recognized by the Northern Miner worldwide for 2023. And we've since that very first hole, we've now drilled 16 holes at Go Sugar. We just wrapped up our drilling at Go Sugar yesterday. We're in the process of, we're finalizing the core logging and the process of demobbing out of camp in the coming days. But we've now drilled 16 holes at Go Sugar, and we're really getting a sense around the mineralization and the orientation of this deposit. We've used borehole EM on every hole, and the borehole EM is telling us that we are continuing to expand this project to depth, and we are expanding this project along strike. So we've got a lot of really, really good stuff coming up at Go Sugar in the future. So I think we're really just getting started. Again, we've only had the project for 18 months. We've drilled 16 holes, and we've really come a long ways in moving this project forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ian, and he's going to delve a little deeper into the exploration work and our forward plans at both projects.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Doug. Yeah, so Doug touched on the Albert Lake project, and since we've become a public company, we this proof of concept with not only drilling but surface geophysics, surface geochemistry. We found the Bay Island Trend, which is our proof of concept that the historic Rottenstone deposit does not occur in isolation. It is definitely part of a significantly larger magmatic system. So this Bay Island Trend that Doug touched upon, 300 plus meters of ultramafic hosted nickel, copper, cobalt, PGE mineralization. But we do recognize the overall nickel tenors are significantly lower than the historic Rottenstone mineralization. So at Bay Island Trend, we've got roughly 2% nickel tenor, and at Rottenstone, the nickel tenors are sort of 7 to 10%. So we switch gears a little bit after, this Bay Island Trend remains open along strike and to depth, but we started focused our attention in this area of the Trombley-Olson Nic 5. Here we've identified this incredibly robust multi-element soil geochemical anomaly. What we're seeing here in this middle image is the nickel in soils, the bright magenta colors being all nickel values over and above the 90th percentile. We see up to 743 parts per nickel in 743 ppm nickel in soils, and we have individual samples that are running over a gram of combined platinum, palladium plus gold. So we're very, very confident there's something within this area that we call the Trombley-Olson claim that is feeding this incredibly robust soil geochemical anomaly. So we will have news out. We did give a bit of an update on our drill program at Albert Lake, and maybe I can touch on that in a couple of slides here. And again, just to things went blank here. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Okay. The Go Sugar Lake project. Yeah. So in 2023, we drilled 9 holes. We've just completed our 2024 Q1 program, 7 holes of roughly 2,600 meters. And I think it's fair to say that in the drill campaigns 2023 and 2024, we have made significant strides in putting this historic deposit back together again. This is a deposit that was defined by drilling in 1966 through 1970, roughly 4.3 million tons of a grade of 0.3. The drilling that was done historically was vertical in nature, And we now understand that there are high-grade vertical sheets of mineralization that I think the previous drilling, the historical drilling, would have missed because they were drilling vertical holes. And based on the 2023 drilling and our better understanding of the geometry and the orientation of these higher grade shoots of mineralization, as you can see, the in red, in bold, is the nickel intercepts over and above 1%. Our 2024 drill campaign, what we have done is we have consistently drilled across the intrusive using a consistent azimuth, incline drill holes, and what's resulted is we are now intersecting these higher grade shoots of mineralization in a much more perpendicular fashion. And so our goal here is, as we continue to build on this historic resource with, you know, each and every hole within the confines of this historic deposit, we are adding tons. And with this recognition of these higher grade shoots, we think that we can do, we can add to the historic grades substantially as well. And now that we are understanding this orientation, we're doing this in a much more efficient and effective manner. And as Doug said, the borehole EM has been a tremendous tool, and it was something that had never been used on this property until Fathom commenced its drill program in 2023. So I'm just going to jump ahead into the appendices part of the presentation here to just elaborate a little bit further on our drilling at the Goshager Lake project. Yeah, so in 2023, the drilling was, you know, more or less designed to understand what is the model, what is the geometry of this deposit. And the blue rectangles that you see, what we're looking at here is a sort of a composite. This is a grade shell, sort of volumetric presentation of how we've interpreted this thing thus far. And the blue plates are the areas of conductivity as defined by the borehole EM. And so what we're speculating here, and then the borehole EM is consistently telling us that there is greater conductivity with depth. So we feel that if you can imagine that the host intrusive is the yellow in this schematic diagram over here on the right-hand side, this being the gabbro, and there's disseminated mineralization throughout the gabbro. This is the, you know, the historic deposit is this disseminated shell halo, if you will, of mineralization. But what we have determined and what we have realized now, there are multiple vertical, almost vein-like material within this disseminated shell. And with this increasing conductivity at depth, we feel that there's potentially a feeder at depth. If you can imagine these magmatic sulfide deposits when they were forming, and you had all this sulfide that has been captured within this intruding magma, and it gets stuck. It can no longer come up this chamber because of its mass. And then what's resulted is you just get these, you know, these veins, these shoots of higher grade mineralization shooting back up into the host intrusive. So we feel that at depth, we're potentially looking at a feeder system. And this is very, very similar to, you know, what we recognize at the Voisey's Bay deposit. So our drilling here in 2024, we did put out some news, which had some photographs of some of the mineralization that we are intersecting. If you recall in the previous slide, there was blue plates down in this area. Our first drill hole went to a depth of 551 meters. It did come through this zone of conductivity. We did intersect semi-massive to massive sulfide mineralization. The second drill hole was from the same platform, but at a more shallow dip. It too intersected semi-massive to massive sulfides. The image in the middle is of cut core. And again, semi-massive to massive sulfide. The image immediately above that is a polished cut piece of core from drill hole 23003. This particular interval ran 2.88% nickel. You can see that I'm highlighting pentlandite in the upper image. I can't really speak to what those white spots are in the middle image, but I'll leave that up to one's imagination. And following the drilling that we did on this initial platform, we went 100 meters to the west. And here too, we've intersected disseminated mineralization in gabbro. Borehole EM results are telling us there are zones of off-hole conductivity. We went another, from the initial platform, we went 100 meters to the east, this being 24016. You can see that there's a gray plate in the background and behind these grade shells. This is a zone of conductivity that was detected in drill hole 23005, drilled last September. The drill hole went through this area of conductivity. We are very, very encouraged with the results we have seen to date, plus the borehole EM survey. And then our final two drill holes were yet another 100 meters off to the east. So we've covered 230 meters of strike with this current drill program that wrapped up yesterday. And the final two drill holes, again, in gabbro, and we did see typical Goshager-like mineralization. So I think as we go forward, we continue, for example, the drill holes, the very first drill holes, you can see that I have dark plates down there now. The borehole EM is telling us that this zone of conductivity continues along strike, east and west, and certainly to depth as well. So this whole methodical approach, now that we understand the geometry of this deposit, is becoming very, very effective as we go forward. So our goal here, if I can just again jump ahead a couple of slides, I just want to touch on the coarse nature of the pentlandite. I did mention that we are drawing some comparisons to Voisey's Bay. We recognize, we're intersecting these massive sulfide veins at Goshager. Typically at Voisey's Bay, these veins are recognized up to 50 meters out into the country rock, which in this case is paranise. I've got a polished section here. This coarse nature of the pentlandite is very, very favorable with respect to metallurgy. And I just want to draw your attention to this middle box diagram. On the left-hand side is percent. So at Goshager Lake, we have 3% cobalt associated with our pentlandite. We've been doing microprobe analysis at the University of Western Ontario. And just by comparison, so here we have 3% at Goshager. Norilsk is only 0.5% cobalt in pentlandite. The Sudbury camp is running around 1%. This is Thompson, and this is Voisey's Bay. So we think this is something that is going to be a very, very significant credit. We think it's something that we can leverage going forward as we attract interested partners into not only this project, but also the Albert Lake project. And if we do our job properly here at Goshager Lake and expand on this resource that was 4 million tons and make it something significantly larger, I'm quite confident now that we recognize these steeply oriented plunging chutes of mineralization that we can expand on this historic grade of 0.3% nickel. And we can't lose sight of the regional implications. So part of our strategy for expanding from the original 5,000 hectares to 22,000 hectares, we wanted to make the Mall Lake nickel occurrence contiguous with the Goshager Lake deposit. These two areas were part of the original option agreement. Through acquisition and additional staking, we're now over 22,000 hectares. Just a quick comment on Mall Lake, 1967 drilling, 8 meters of better than 1% nickel. The nickel copper ratio is the same as what we recognize at Goshager. The host rock is the same. So here, the fact that these two occurrences, deposits, are 10 kilometers apart speaks to a much bigger sort of regional potential within this particular area and within our 22,000 hectares. The rectangle is an airborne survey that was flown in 2008. Nobody has bothered to follow up at all on any of the findings of this 2008 VTEM survey. The star is the location of the Goshager Lake deposit. All these yellow polygons are geophysical signatures derived from the VTEM survey by our own geophysical team, and they're suggesting that these are like Goshagers. So we potentially have multiple Goshager-like deposits within our 22,000 hectares. And finally, just a little bit more comment on Albert Lake. We will have a press release with assays forthcoming. And just to summarize the drilling that was done, we did have an update a couple of weeks ago. We were disappointed that the very first hole that was targeting this incredibly robust EM anomaly at a depth of about 300 meters below surface turned out to be formational. We had mineralization over a significant width, but this mineralization was not magmatic. It was essentially sulfidic iron formation. So just a lot of sulfide, non-nickel bearing sulfide tied up in the regional sediments. The other 5 holes that we drilled, they've all detected off-hole conductivity from the borehole EM. We do have one drill hole that did intersect rottenstone-like stratigraphy, and the press release will be discussing what came out of that particular drill hole and why we think that this is a very, very incredible, a very, very significant development as we continue our quest to try and find more of this fantastic rottenstone style of mineralization. So having said that, Doug, what I'll do is I'll revert back to the cap table.
Okay.
And just bear with me here as I...
While you're doing that, I'll just remind everybody of the financings that we completed at the end of December and into February. So we raised about 3.3 million in mostly flow through in December, and then we kept that financing open. We had a number of U.S. investors who preferred a 2024 close. So we closed the balance of that in February. So a total of $4 or $5 million raised here in the last, 4 months or so. That gives us a basic shares outstanding of about 140 million. We have added a number of warrants. And unfortunately, in this market, there's an expectation that there's at least a half warrant attached to most equity raises. So on a fully diluted basis, we are at 200 million. The earliest of those warrants will expire in May of 2025. And almost all of them are priced right in around 20 cents. The dollar figure that we see in the cash balance, that this is a couple of weeks ago, so that does not take into account the finalization of the drilling at Goshager. So once the dust is settled, we'll come out of this round of exploration work with about a little less than $1 million in the treasury. So that'll keep us going from a G&A and corporate perspective for the next 18 months or so. Market cap is a little off here in the last couple of days, so we're down in around the $12.5 million mark. So I think we've got some room to make up here for sure. The price of nickel has not been helping us in the last year or so, but we think that the worst of the damage in terms of commodity prices has been done, and we do see some positive momentum in nickel pricing here in the last 2.5-3 months. And just a summary of the milestones that we've accomplished to date and that we expect for the balance of the year. Again, we just finished yesterday the Go Sugar program. So in total, we've drilled about 4,000 meters between Albert Lake and Go Sugar. Again, assays will be out later this week on Albert Lake, and we expect assays at Go Sugar mid to late May, assuming that the labs continue to pump out their results as quickly as they have here during Q1 of this year. We are in the process of permitting Go Sugar. So our current permit expires in July, but we've our permit application is out for consultation as we speak. That includes the construction of a 20 to 25 person camp and up to 15,000 meters of drilling. So we expect to have that in hand within the next 4 to 6 weeks. That'll allow us to construct that camp in advance of future drilling. And we're working on a number of initiatives to really reduce the reliance on helicopter in particular. And if we can get that done, we'll see a significant decrease in our cost per meter on a go-forward basis. That's really it in a nutshell. I'd invite Timothy back in, and we can answer any questions that people might have.
Great. Thank you, Ian and Doug, for the very informative presentation. We'll now start the Q&A portion of the webinar. A reminder to everyone on the line that you can type your questions into the chat box at any time. We already do have a couple of questions. First, you had mentioned the recent drilling at Go Sugar, but obviously assays are still pending. But based on those visual observations, is the mineralization you encountered in those holes similar to previous drilling, or are there some differences in what you're seeing?
I think the goal of the news release that we put out last week with those particular images was to demonstrate that it's similar. Yes, this is consistent with what we intersected in 2023, and the fact that we are now intersecting this same mineralization significantly deeper, I think, is a very, very positive development in the project.
Great. You recently did do some drilling at Albert Lake, but obviously you mentioned, some of it hits, things that didn't look like mineralization, and then you moved the drills. However, what did you see, and obviously with some of the borehole geophysics and so on, what do you see there that might change how you target your next round of drilling there in the future?
That's a really good question. And, I think, I mentioned that we do have rottenstone-like stratigraphy in one of our drill holes. We had what was kind of, Doug and I had a sort of a heart-to-heart as we were going through our Albert Lake project, because we were finding that the borehole EM, and in fact, one particular case, it was a near miss. And the off-hole conductivity that we were seeing were at depths of, sort of 0 to 50 meters below surface. And this was consistent with, our first hole was the deep hole, and the next, 76, 77, 78. We went out on the lake for 79, and then we came back and drilled 80 because we were seeing all of these shallow off-hole conductors. And the fact that we're relying on the helicopter, we just thought, this is kind of crazy to have to move our drill to drill a 50 to 75 meter hole, a 50 to 100 meter hole, because of the shallow nature of these off-hole conductors. And important to point out, this deep conductor was incredibly robust. It translated into sulfatic iron formation. So you have to be very, very careful that we don't get too focused on the very robust EM anomalies. And some of these other things that we're seeing are not strong EM signals, but somewhat moderate, weak to moderate signals. And I think that's encouraging. So having said that, what I see here is if these shallow conductors are indeed mineralized, ultramafic, rottenstone-like rock, and they're small individual boudins, a collection of these could explain this incredibly robust soil geochemical anomaly. Now, another thesis would be that these are all sort of individual pathways that are leading to something that is incredibly, let's just try and visualize this. So if we have, again, this 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer soil geochemical anomaly, and it's rich in all the elements that we're seeking and all the pathfinder elements that are telling us that there's a large ultramafic body buried at depth. If one of these conductors is just sort of an individual pathway to something significantly larger and a little bit deeper, well, then that is explaining this very, very robust soil geochemical anomaly on surface. So what we'd like to do is, I think what we need to do now is reconcile surface EM with the borehole EM. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is we've got to tighten up our line spacing with the surface EM. And I think what we have to start doing now is reconciling areas within this soil geochemical anomaly, again, by tighter grids. We have tried, 4-acid leach on the soils. We have done aqua regia. We've done MMI. There are other techniques that we can actually use as well. But I think tightening up the soil grid so that we're doing very, very tight individual grids in these areas in an attempt to reconcile with subsurface geophysics and bring in a drill that we can move around via track-mounted vehicle, or pull it behind a small bulldozer or something like that, so that we can, if we have to drill a hole and the borehole EM says, well, you should go over there, but only 10 meters, we can do it with a tractor as opposed to having to build a brand new platform and have the helicopter only bump it over 10 meters. So this was part of the reason why we stopped the Albert Lake program a little bit short. It's kind of a good problem, I think, because we've got all these very shallow, very interesting looking targets. And again, having recognized rottenstone-like stratigraphy in one of the drill holes, I think sets us up quite nicely for the next round of exploration and ultimately more drilling.
Great. And then looking at your 2 projects, obviously you've done work on both. Which project is your favorite, or what? How will you plan to divvy up the resources going forward?
Doug always has a good answer to this question. So Doug, over to you.
Yeah, we get that question all the time. And our standard answer is it's like trying to pick your favorite child. We love them both. And we continue to. Having said that, as a junior in this current market environment, it is difficult to finance 2 projects equally. And we had told people prior to this round of exploration that a favorite might emerge. And so I think where it's looking like is we will probably, going forward, at least in the short to medium term, be focusing more of our dollars and our efforts at Goshager. We view Goshager as a more straightforward path to a resource. We think if we can put up to a 10,000 meter program in place and drill that out over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, we come out the back end of that with we should be looking at our maiden resource at Go Sugar. Having said all that, by no means are we changing our view on Albert Lake, but it's just in this tight financial environment. I think we just have to. It's just difficult to be in a position to finance both projects equally.
Another question here: have you had any conversations with producers or larger companies in the space? Are they keeping an eye on what you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. And some of those conversations go back a couple of years. We have had conversations with majors, but I would say that the in recent months, say in the last 6 to 8 months, we've had more people reach out to us, and from, I guess, a variety of different places, not just geographically, but we're talking to majors. We're talking to more. They wouldn't be majors, but more strategics, off takers. Those types of organizations. And I think what we're seeing in this industry is that the strategics are getting involved in juniors at much earlier stages than they ever historically did. So, those conversations are happening, and they will continue to happen, we expect.
Great. Yeah, we've certainly seen quite a few strategics coming in with investments in the nickel space in the last couple of years, haven't we?
Mm-hmm.
That's good. One question, always popular. Obviously, you had just raised some funds for your exploration work, but how much cash do you have, and how long will that last with your current plans?
Yeah. So again, once the all of our bills are paid for this most recent exploration work, we'll have just under $1 million, and that keeps us going from a corporate perspective for a year and a half. We can, in this industry, sort of roll with the punches. We could make that last longer if we had to. But in terms of the next round of exploration work, it will require capital, and whether that is a combination of equity financing, bringing in a joint venture type partner, or some other hybrid with a strategic like we just talked about. Those conversations and those decisions will be made in the coming months.
Okay, great. And I think that's all the questions we have, but maybe one question I'll ask, kind of just to review, what news and what are some key catalysts we might expect from Fathom in the coming weeks and months?
Yeah, well, as mentioned, we are working on a press release that will sort of bring the drilling that we did at Albert Lake to a close. And I was quite surprised at the rapid turnaround of those assays from the lab. So I'm hopeful that the Goshager Lake assay results will be as quick. And if that's the case, I think we'll be looking at possibly mid-May to have all results in hand. Doug and I were in the field at while we were drilling at Goshager, and we personally delivered a batch of samples ourselves. So those are in the lab, and then there was another batch delivered this past weekend. So hopefully by mid to late May, we do have all of those assay results in hand, and at which point we'll be in a position to release them. Great.
Well, I'd like to again thank Ian Fraser and Doug Porter for presenting today. And thank you everyone on the line for tuning in. Red Cloud Securities will be back tomorrow when our webinar series continues with Seabridge Gold presenting Wednesday, April 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Timothy.
Thank you very much, Tim.
Thanks, everyone.